It is May 1873. A heavy, unseasonable heat hangs over the plains of Labette County, Kansas. A posse of 50 armed men rides up to a solitary, single-room wooden cabin on the Osage Trail. The cabin is completely abandoned. The horses in the corral are starving, but it's the smell that stops the men in their tracks. A thick, sweet, metallic stench of decaying flesh radiating from the property. Inside, they notice a trap door nailed shut beneath the bed. They pry it open, revealing a dark, 6-foot-deep cellar where the earthen floor is entirely soaked in coagulated, rotting blood. But there are no bodies. The men move outside to the property's small apple orchard and begin probing the soft soil with iron ramrods. Within minutes, they strike something. What they unearth over the next 48 hours will permanently shatter the innocence of the American West. 11 bodies, all buried in shallow graves, every single victim with their skull completely crushed in and their throat slit from ear to ear. When we look at the history of the Wild West, we are usually sold a very specific type of romanticized violence. We hear about the bank-robbing outlaws of Deadwood or the high-noon shootouts of Tombstone. Even in modern media, like the video game Red Dead Redemption 2, the developers designed a terrifying encounter at the Aberdeen pig farm, where an overly hospitable family lures the player inside to drug and rob them. Millions of gamers felt a primal dread during that scene, yet few realized that Digital Nightmare was a direct, historical echo of the Bender cabin. The archives tell a much darker story than Hollywood ever could. The most terrifying monsters on the frontier weren't gunslingers. They were a quiet, immigrant family serving hot meals to weary travelers. They were America's first recorded serial killer family, the Bloody Benders. To understand how a family could run a slaughterhouse entirely undetected for over 18 months, you have to understand the vulnerable psychology of the frontier in 1871. Following the Civil War, the Osage Trail in southeastern Kansas was a massive artery for pioneers moving west. Men rode alone, carrying their entire life savings in gold coins strapped to their waists, ready to buy land. Out on the open prairie, there were no hotels. There was an unwritten, sacred rule of frontier hospitality. If a traveler saw a candle in a window, it was universally understood they could pay a few cents for a hot meal and sleep by the fire. You had to trust strangers. If you didn't, the prairie winter would kill you. The Bender family didn't just break this trust, they weaponized it. The family arrived in Kansas in 1870, consisting of 4 members. John Bender Sr. was a hulking, silent man who spoke in guttural grunts. His wife, Elvira, was later referred to by neighbors as a she-devil due to her fierce temper. Their adult son, John Jr., played the role of a harmless half-wit. But the architect of the entire operation was the daughter, Kate Bender. Kate was young, highly attractive, and fiercely intelligent. She claimed to be a psychic medium and a healer during a time when the spiritualism movement was exploding across America. She distributed flyers offering to hold seances and contact the dead. She was the bait. Wealthy travelers would intentionally divert their routes just to visit the Bender Inn, lured in by the promise of a hot meal and the captivating presence of the beautiful mystic. Let's look at the forensic architecture of the murder room. The Bender cabin was small, measuring just 16 by 24 feet, but it was ingeniously divided into 2 rooms by a thick, heavy canvas wagon cover hung from the ceiling. The front half was a small grocery store and dining area. The back half was the family's private living quarters. When a wealthy traveler sat down for dinner, they were directed to the seat of honor, positioned so the guest's back was pressed directly against the canvas curtain. As the guest ate, Kate Bender would sit across from them, keeping their attention locked with her intense gaze and charming conversation. She would subtly extract information about whether anyone was expecting them and how much money they were carrying. If Kate determined the victim was wealthy and isolated, she gave the signal. From the darkness behind the canvas curtain, either John Sr. or John Jr. would raise a heavy blacksmith's sledgehammer. Guided by the impression of the guest's head pressing against the fabric, they would swing with absolute, crushing force. The blow would instantly cave in the victim's skull, but the Benders left nothing to chance. The moment the body slumped forward, Elvira or John Jr. would step around the curtain with a knife and slit the victim's throat. Underneath the dining table was a trap door. They would simply pull a leather strap, open the floor, and kick the bleeding corpse directly into the dark cellar below. They would strip the body of gold, watches, and cash, and under the cover of night, drag the remains out to the apple orchard. The cabin was reset, the blood was washed away, and the candle was placed back in the window for the next traveler. This mechanical, domestic slaughterhouse operated flawlessly because the frontier was so vast and dangerous that local authorities simply assumed missing men had been killed by Native Americans or died of exposure. But every serial killer eventually makes a fatal mistake. The Benders' mistake was murdering Dr. William York in the spring of 1873. Dr. York wasn't a nameless drifter. He had two incredibly powerful brothers, Colonel Ed York, a Civil War veteran, and Alexander York, a Kansas state senator. When William failed to return, Colonel York gathered a heavily armed posse and tracked his brother's exact route to the Bender cabin. The Benders played their roles perfectly. Kate acted sympathetic, and Elvira played the confused old woman. They claimed Dr. York had ridden off safely into the night. Colonel York was suspicious, but a massive spring storm suddenly broke over the plains, forcing him to take shelter in a neighboring town. That storm bought the Benders a 48-hour head start. Realizing the net was closing, they packed their wagon in the dead of night and fled into the boundless American frontier. When Colonel York returned days later, he found the rotting cellar and the horrific mass grave in the orchard. The forensic exhumation was a nightmare. They pulled Dr. York from the dirt, his skull shattered, alongside 9 other men killed in the exact same mechanical fashion. But the detail that truly horrified the nation was the discovery of a young man named George Loncher and his 18-month-old infant daughter. The autopsy reports of the era indicated that while the father had his skull crushed, the toddler had no visible injuries. She had simply been thrown into the hole with her dead father and buried under the Kansas dirt while she was still breathing. The discovery sparked one of the largest, most frantic manhunts in United States history. A massive bounty was placed on the family's heads, and Pinkertons and vigilante mobs scoured the country. And here is where the historical record turns into a ghost story. They were never officially caught. For decades, rumors swirled. Some claimed a vigilante mob caught the family on the trail, shot them, and threw their bodies into the Verdigris River, swearing a blood oath of silence. Others believed the Benders successfully made it to a train station, split their stolen gold, and vanished into the crowded streets of New York, or fled back to Europe. The true fate of the Bloody Benders remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 19th century. They shattered the golden rule of frontier hospitality, proving that out on the edges of civilization, the most dangerous predators didn't wear black masks or carry six-shooters. They wore aprons, smiled warmly, and offered you a seat at their table. To reconstruct the exact psychological profile and the terrifying mechanics of the Bender cabin, I heavily relied on Susan Jonusas' brilliant historical true crime book, Hell's Half Acre: The Untold Story of the Benders. It strips away a century of folklore and gets down to the actual forensic facts of the investigation. For deeper regional context on the Kansas frontier and the mass panic the murders caused, the historical records compiled in Fern Morrow Wood's book, The Benders, Keepers of the Devil's Inn, were absolutely invaluable. These texts help us understand that the Benders weren't just killers. They were an anomaly that forced the American West to change how it viewed the stranger at the door. They proved that the sacred rule of hospitality was a biological liability in a world without law. Forget the myth of the honorable Wild West outlaw. The most terrifying monsters on the American frontier were an immigrant family who ran a quiet roadside inn. In this historical autopsy, we deconstruct how the Bloody Benders weaponized frontier hospitality and a mechanical murder trap to slaughter dozens before vanishing into history.